Welcome to the J.R. Hendrick Texas Consort. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the adventure. The J.R. Hendrick Texas Consort. This episode is hereby called J.R.'s Dream To Dillemma. October 4th, 1993, 3 a.m. J.R. had been up and down all night with stomach and emotional upset. He's disappointed with his father and upset with Brad and Jim Bob. Jim Bob's aunt took him back to Odessa. J.R. found out that Jim Bob Horton wanted to be a psychological researcher for criminal justice studies at Tall City College, established in 1909 by some LDS missionaries from Louisiana. Its counterpart is Odessa University College and Lubbock University College. Last night, J.R. talked to Ken about a Bible study he was attending with Brad on some Thursday evenings and got a very chilly reception. J.R. had also learned yesterday that Cheesecake Toastmasters was changing its meetings to Tuesday nights next semester. He knows that the study room isn't open until 4 a.m. and the electronic key won't work until that time. So he goes downstairs to the dorm living room. True to form, Charlie Nation is passed out on the couch as Murphy Brown has just got off of Fox TV. And so J.R. goes out to the fountain to sit and pray. Today he would have breakfast at TNC with Kevin McDonald. Meanwhile, his father is in his truck on his way from Swainfield Ranch to a rig in Denver City with Claude. The rig looked very promising. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, all is quiet except for Elizabeth, who is suffering from pains regarding her cancer. She mixes a vinegar tonic, which helps ease the pain. 4:25 a.m. in Miami. 4:25 a.m. Eastern in Miami. Kyle wakes up to complete his training. He has 2 more weeks before he can return back to Texas. He has requested to return to recruiter status in Midland, Odessa for a time so he could get a chance to see Jim and Betsy off to Washington, D.C. should President Clinton give, quote-unquote, Daddy an appointment. 4 a.m. Central. J.R. goes into the main study room lounge at Gordon Hall. He is relieved that Don, the on-duty RA, asked Charlie to return to his room. He begins studying for government and statistics. J.R. learned last night that Spanish class was canceled today because George Hooper had to take his wife, English professor Dr. Anna Hooper, to the doctor. Meanwhile, Jim and Claude are almost on the way to Denver City as they listen to Chris Ledoux and Garth Brooks. 4:40 a.m. Jim and Claude arrive at the location in Denver City. Jim is delighted to see the rig in full operation and working within his standards. He knew he would give a positive report to the Railroad Commission when he had a teleconference with them from a boardroom in Jacksonville, Florida. 5:30 a.m. JR has breakfast with Kevin McDonald at TNC. JR, donuts, really? Kevin said. Man, you seem real down. I don't know, JR said. Donuts are a comfort to me. And maybe there's hope for me and Karen. If it weren't for Brad, I don't know. Brad. Man, I don't know. I don't see how a hottie like her could take a ferret like Brad. JR laughed. Agreed. Back in the 50s, Granddad Swain said he had to shoot at least 10 prairie dogs a year from bothering his cattle and goats. 8 a.m. In government class, Jack Fitzmiller was still out, presenting an academic paper in Sacramento, California, with a chance to meet President Clinton before the president departed to San Francisco. Frederick McKay talked about the designers of the Texas Constitution. JR was intrigued and took copious notes. 8:50 a.m. After class, Mr. McKay stops JR. Hendrick, hold up, McKay said. I just spoke to Andrew Harmon. He's the advisor for public affairs. Mass Communications Department, room 220. Well, he also see you on November 5th. We'll be delighted to see you. 9:15 a.m. JR walks into the office of Isidro Sanchez. Sanchez is working on his master's degree and PhD, staying at Tech. He takes JR down to the lab where Belinda, the lab assistant, put him through some audio and written exercises for the test tomorrow. Meanwhile, in Denver City, Jim is slightly disappointed that the rig is not fully functional. The rig's phone lines had not been installed yet. He decides to drive back to Midland to tend to his office. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Elizabeth instructs a foreman. Betsy instructs a foreman to slaughter 4 deer to take to the butcher. Her mother, Elizabeth, meanwhile, is making lemonade. Today was the day she would go see Dr. Hood for radical treatment and to see whether to resume chemotherapy. 10:50 a.m. Dave Smith pulls up in front of the foreign language building. Hey man, let's go, Gerald said, getting into the car. Good to see you, Dave. Dave Smith pulls his car out of the drive. Hey Dave, in high school, you were good in sports, weren't you? Gerald asked. Yeah. The Hogan Steers swim team won 5 gold medals, Dave said. Well, I won 2 gold medals in prep school, with 1 bronze medal my sophomore year. See, Big Springs is a small town. And so getting a slot on the swim team was easy. They drive to it. One guy's for Italy's for lunch. 11:55 a.m. In the car, JR and Dave have another conversation. My parents, man, JR said. Man, they just don't get it with me. Daddy's busy promoting himself, and Mama's busy finding himself. Stop complaining, Dave said. You never had to live in Big Spring. I spent my first 8 years living in the city, in a townhouse with Mama and Daddy. When we moved to the ranch, I was happy for the most part. Then Daddy leaves the company in my hands for a year while he plays around in Washington. Be grateful your dad took an interest in you. 1 p.m. Statistics class is being moved to the first floor of the math building due to some temporary remodeling. Today, Stephanie Rogers, the professor, is discussing confidence intervals and deviation from the normal curve. 2 p.m. At the request of Jim Hendrick, she brought in some tactical graphs for JR. 2 p.m. Meanwhile, in downtown Midland, Jim is getting ready for the possible shutdown of the rig in Eastland because it lacked the necessary employee safety precautions. 2:05 p.m. Brad meets JR outside the math building. JR, I'm sorry, Brad said. Jim Bob was so ditzy. He wouldn't have come to your baptism had I not invited him, and his aunt agreed to take him. But now, I refuse to hang out with Ken. He's too wild for my taste. Well, how about for the time being, you are too tame for my taste, JR said. Whatever. He walks off where Dave Smith takes him to Gordon Hall to do statistics homework. October 5th was a big day. Unfortunately, however, Jim did have to shut down that rig, and so he's relieved to be able to get a chance. October 6th. October 6th, 8:20 a.m. JR had quite a morning. He had breakfast at the Scriptu Club with Brent Clark and C.B. Coleman. In class, Jack Fitzmiller's lecturing again when Frederick McKay walks in. I want to introduce you to a fine lecturer, Fitzmiller said. You had him Friday and Monday, and he teaches